Hello and welcome to the Planning Law Roundtable Discussion for the 2021 APA Kentucky Conference. My name is Brian Davis, Planning Manager with Louisville Metro Planning and Design and the APA Kentucky Chapter President.
And I am Brian Howard, Executive Director of the Owensboro Metropolitan Planning Commission and the APA Kentucky Past President, in a term that seems like it has been never ending. We are your hosts both physically and virtually today for this session, which is good for 1.5 hours of continuing education law credits.
This is a bit of a unique session today because of the unprecedented COVID times we are in, but it has given us an opportunity to assemble a wide range of experts to comment on a variety of topics that we might otherwise not be able to present to conference goers.
So today we have several attorneys that will be joining us, the first of which is Tara Knight, who is going to talk about the open meeting and requirements and recent changes to the Open Records Act that went into effect this summer.
We also have Laura Ferguson and Travis Feaster, who are going to give us an update on the state of emergency and discuss how Louisville Metro government has been operating throughout 2020 and 2021.
We will then be changing directions and in fact going quite sky high as we talk with Timothy Tyson about the use of drones in planning.
I was really hoping that he would talk about drone pizza deliveries, but I guess that will be for another session. But what we will be talking about to wrap up this session is how planners can stay informed on legislative actions that may impact them. And that discussion will be with Kristin Curry.
So without further ado, we'll begin the Planning Law Roundtable session.
Oh, hold up, aren't you forgetting something?
Like what?
Well, don't you think since this is a law session, we probably should have some kind of disclaimer at the beginning?
Attorneys do like disclaimers, that's true. How about something like this?
Materials contained in this presentation do not constitute legal advice. Because of the ever-changing nature of the law and unique issues each legal problem involves, you should not rely on any information in this presentation and should consult an attorney for specific legal issues. Also, the opinions expressed by individual planners and attorneys are solely theirs and do not reflect those of APA, APA Kentucky, or anyone other than themselves. Some comments may be a compilation of comments received from numerous sources and is not intended to be attributed to, nor a portrayal of any single individual. Thank you.
Good morning, Tara. I appreciate you taking the time today to participate in our law session prep for the 2021 APA Kentucky Fall Conference. Ms. Tara Knight, she's a partner with the law firm Thacker, Hodgkins & Knight. She's been an attorney since 2005 and a partner with the firm since 2007. And she's also served as the attorney for the Owensboro Metropolitan Planning Commission for the last 8 years. So she's got a lot of law experience, background, and working as an attorney both in the private sector but the public sector, serving as our attorney. So appreciate you taking the time today to answer a few questions for our law session at the Fall Conference.
Sure, no problem. Happy to do it.
Yeah, so what we're going to focus on today with you is talking about the impact COVID had on planning commission meetings, board of adjustment meetings, how that kind of factored into changes that had to take place at the local level. So really the first question would pertain to, during the pandemic, how did that impact meetings? How did it impact these virtual platforms, Zoom and GoToMeeting and any of the other things? How did those impact local planning and zoning, both at the staff level, office level, and planning commission meeting level?
Sure. So speaking on behalf of what we did locally here in Davis County and what we saw other planning offices do during that time, virtual hearings became a very useful tool to allow local planning commissions to continue to address the business community and the needs of the business community safely, being able to move applications forward while also protecting the health of the commissioners, the staff, applicants, and other interested members of the community who were wanting to otherwise be involved in the process.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, I know it took us a little while to get it figured out, and along with many other planning commissions, when COVID first started in March, I know we didn't have a meeting in April, or meetings in April, because everybody was scrambling trying to figure out technology. But after that, we started using Zoom as a platform and holding the meetings, which was great. As far as how that worked, what is required by the Planning Commission in order to be able to do a virtual meeting?
Sure. So planning commissions must hold their meetings in a manner that, one, complies with the Open Meetings Act, And 2, it affords procedural due process to all those involved. And so those 2 requirements really do work hand in hand. The fundamental requirement of due process is that affected parties must be given the opportunity to be heard at a meaningful time and in a meaningful manner. And so the Planning Commission must have a hearing, they have to take evidence, they have to weigh that evidence, and then they have to make findings of fact, either for or against an application. But those findings of fact have to be supported by the evidence. And so the Open Meetings Act further codifies this by setting forth the requirements that prohibit a public agency from conducting meetings in secret. It all has to be transparent and open, and by allowing people to participate in the process.
Right. And again, kind of going back to our experience, that was a bit of a challenge sometimes, to make sure that everybody knew the technology and understood it, and they were able to join the meeting and participate. And so I know us, along with everybody else, had to deal with those types of issues. This use of technology, the video conferencing or teleconferencing, that type of thing, historically, has that been allowed, or what changes went in
Sure.
place during the pandemic to allow that as a venue or an avenue for meetings to continue to take place?
Sure. And so we've kind of been talking, hinting around about this a little bit, but like you said, we didn't have meetings to begin with for a month or 2. And so those are really the only options. Either we have no meetings and no business is conducted, or we get creative and try to do something else. But really, this use of video teleconferencing and virtual hearings was not new. KRS Chapter 61, which is the Open Meetings Act, has long provided that a public agency can conduct any meeting through the use of video teleconference. The important requirement has always been that the members of the public agency must be able to both be seen and heard. And so what was new, and as a result of the pandemic, was that once the state of Kentucky declared a state of emergency and several government orders were issued restricting the number of people allowed to gather together indoors, otherwise imposing stay-at-home orders, that's when the Kentucky Attorney General's office came out with some additional guidance on how meetings could be conducted via video teleconference. Previously, again, they were always allowed, but if a public agency chose to hold its hearing via video teleconference, it was required to designate a primary physical location where the public could still gather to view the video teleconference and the meeting, if feasible. And so the Kentucky Attorney General's office issued an opinion letter stating that due to the pandemic and the various government restrictions in place, it was no longer feasible to designate that primary physical location where a meeting could be viewed. So the opinion provided that instead, the agency had to specifically identify a website or a TV station or some other technological means by which the public could view the meeting, and that was sufficient to comply with the act. So that was what we did here. We directed everyone to our website, and the website contained the link for our Zoom meetings.
Right. And, we made an effort to make sure that was published and publicized well in advance to make sure that everybody had the opportunity to participate if they so chose. What changes in the process, if any, were needed to make the virtual hearings be able to take place and happen?
So, of course, our meetings were still able to be conducted at the same time on the same days. No changes to the common, agenda format that we normally use were made. The only major change was the notification requirement that we just discussed. And so instead of providing a physical location of the meeting, notification was provided directing people to the website, and there they could find the Zoom link. It was published that it was going to be a virtual meeting as opposed to the physical meeting, so that everybody was put on notice of that. All the meetings were recorded. And for those, probably everybody's familiar with Zoom at this point, but for those not familiar, Zoom gave participants the option of using the audio and video feature. So they could also be seen and heard. Of course, the commissioners and the board members were all on using their video and audio so that they could be seen and heard. Participants are able to type questions or comments using the chat feature. Brian, you conducted most of those meetings and you read those comments or questions into the record as well. And for those who did, sometimes we had technical difficulties, but the participants, if they had issues with their video, Zoom provides a call-in phone number where they could also call in and at least ask their questions and hear the meeting from that point on. So that was nice. So there were several ways that applicants and just, interested members of the public could participate in those virtual meetings. It should be noted that Kentucky case law has long held that procedural due process doesn't require agencies to conduct business only in the most convenient locations at the most convenient times. All that is required is the opportunity to be heard. And so, fortunately, video teleconferencing provided that opportunity so that the business of the community could continue during those difficult times. And so while, there were some technological issues and some adjustments to be made, it was nice to be able to afford everybody that procedural due process.
Right. And one of the things that we've done and I know other communities have done, we held some meetings completely virtual. And then we did some meetings as a hybrid format where, we had people in a room and video going on, but then also had the opportunity for people at home to participate in that meeting as well. So, there are lots of different possibilities to conduct those meetings. And I think we've tried to explore about all of them and done a little bit of all of them over the last year and a half. I guess the last question, and kind of changing topics a little bit, but the last question that I'd like to get from you as an attorney, because it's something we deal with in our office. At the end of June of this year, some changes went in place dealing with open records request, and the Attorney General's office, actually there's basically a unified public records inspection form now, and that type of a thing. Could you talk a little bit about the changes of that law that went into effect on June 28th and how it is impacting or could impact local planning commission offices?
Sure. Yeah, so I'll first kind of tie that into what we've been talking about, which is the open meetings and the changes that you're talking about that went into effect on June 28th. I think there is a question now as to whether the state of emergency is still declared. The legislature's kind of dealt with that off and on this year, and it's been working its way through courts, et cetera. But I think with regard to even the video teleconferencing at this point, there's a question of whether or not it can all be virtual or if a physical primary location has to be designated now to comply with the Open Meetings Act. So just kind of throwing that in, erring on the side of caution, that's probably the way to do it going forward. And then with regard to the changes to the Open Records Act, those changes don't necessarily have anything to do with the pandemic at all. But a couple of the highlights, agencies now have 5 days in which to respond to requests rather than the 3. So that's helpful to give that extra time. Also, the changes emphasize that requests that are emailed can be accepted as long as the request itself is proper. I think they're not wanting to get so hung up on the forms, but again, the request has to be proper in order to be accepted and processed. And then perhaps the biggest change is that only residents of the Commonwealth of Kentucky may request to inspect public records, which I read as meaning basically public agencies only have to answer requests made by residents of the Commonwealth, which in residents of the Commonwealth includes not only individuals residing in Kentucky, but also Kentucky business entities, those that are actually formed here in Kentucky or located here in Kentucky, but also those that are registered in the state of Kentucky to conduct business here. And that's a process that they do through the Kentucky Secretary of State's office. So you could always look on that website to verify whether the entity is actually a Kentucky business entity or if they are registered in Kentucky. That also includes individuals that are employed and working at a location in Kentucky. And then, of course, anyone representing any of those that fit in that category. So, even if it's an out-of-state attorney, but they represent a Kentucky business and they make an open records request, then that request would have to be honored and answered, assuming, again, that it's otherwise a proper request. And then also news gathering organizations qualify and are able to seek records under the Open Records Act. So.
Right. Yeah. So those are, some pretty significant changes to that process. And it's something we've kept track of. We've updated our information and request process and all that. So I assume most people are aware of it, but I did want to cover that as a last question today, since it is something that certainly could impact communities all across the state. So with that, Tara, I really appreciate your time this morning and answering a few questions. And we, at the end of this session, if people have questions, you never know, you might get an email or something from somebody, asking for some follow-up. But otherwise, really appreciate the opportunity to pick your brain and get some answers today.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to do it. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Tara.
All right, joining us now, we have Travis Feaster and Laura Ferguson. They have agreed to come and talk to us a little bit about some pressing land use planning law related issues that we've all been dealing with here for about the last year and a half or so. But before we get started, I'll let them introduce themselves. Travis, you want to go first?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Travis Feaster, Assistant County Attorney in Louisville Metro. I won't belabor the point. You all have my bio if you want to know more about my background, but I will say I'm a U of L law grad, and I've been with the county attorney's office for almost 5 years as an attorney and a couple additional ones as a law clerk.
All right, thank you. Laura, what about you?
Yeah, Laura Ferguson, Assistant County Attorney. I've been with the County Attorney's Office for 2 years, and prior to that, I was with Louisville Forward and Economic Development, and prior to that, with the Department of Revenue at the state.
All right, and Laura has even sat on the Louisville Metro Planning Commission, so she has experiences not only as being a commissioner, but being an attorney for the Planning Commission. So
that's true.
Yeah. Thank you both for joining us today. We have been putting this off as long as we possibly could. So we are recording on September 20th of 2021, and in hopes that we would know a little bit more about what was going on with the special session that was called by the General Assembly. So what is the current status of the state of emergency here in Kentucky?
So there's been a lot of potential movement, I should say, over the last month or so, what with the Supreme Court decision coming down in favor of the legislature. And then we were waiting for a while for the circuit court to issue some sort of order. But ultimately, it seems like there has been some legislative solution reached through House Joint Resolution 1, which was passed, I think, on January 15th of, I'm sorry, it extends the state of emergency through January 15th of next year. So for the time being, the state of emergency remains in place, as well as the suspensions provided in Senate Bill 150 that relate to KRS 100 and some other important statutory restrictions. The language used there is to the extent the provisions are not superseded by statute or administrative regulation. So for our purposes, for KRS 100 and the like, we're good to go, but there are some other aspects that were tweaked during the state of emergency that have been further modified. And so, I advise everyone to do their own research on that front if you have further interest in Senate Bill 150 beyond the KRS 100 portion.
Okay, so what are the current rules regarding virtual meetings and virtual public hearings that we've all been trying to play by for the last little bit?
So the current rules are still the standard rules that have always existed under open meetings, plus the overlay of Senate Bill 150 that we've been stating in our opening statement in the meeting. The real difference is Senate Bill 150 doesn't require us to necessarily have a physical location. We typically provide it anyway for people who are technology challenged, usually at the old jail or early on at the 444 building. But we're still, and at least as long as the state of emergency and these other measures are still in place, we'll be operating under the same rules we have been since Senate Bill 150 was put in place.
All right, thank you. So you mentioned how Louisville Metro has our kind of default in-person location. What other methods has Louisville Metro been implementing to handle these virtual meetings?
So we've done quite a few things. One is this software that you're using, WebEx. I don't know if Metro had ever conducted a WebEx meeting, at least not to my knowledge, prior to COVID. And now it seems like I have dozens of meetings a week on this platform. So that's been a major transition. Obviously, no planning commission, board of zoning adjustment, metro council meetings at least have been conducted prior to COVID on this platform. So that's been maybe some learning difficulties at the beginning, but we got there, and it's going fairly smoothly. As Lauren mentioned, Senate Bill 150 meant that we weren't required to provide a physical space, which was one of the issues we encountered right when COVID first hit. Was, well, we're required to provide a physical space, but because of social distancing and the concern about spread of the virus, providing a physical space could potentially be, a primary safety concern. And so what Metro did to try to work with the existing law early on was provide a room that was socially distanced, where folks could come in, be masked, and have access to a computer if they didn't have one at home, so they could, still get on the record and participate. I think we've provided some such space for every meeting throughout COVID, at least for Planning Commission and Board of Zoning Adjustment. So fortunately, we had the space availability to provide that socially distanced in-person contact.
And I think when we had the social unrest downtown, we had moved the physical space briefly out to the Allgaier Center.
Yeah, that's right. We did have to move, and we may have had to move it once or twice. I think was there a leak or something? I thought there was some sort of maintenance issue at some point, but I may be mistaken. But fortunately, we had some backup locations ready to go.
Right. Yeah, we've been fortunate enough to have a couple of different locations that we could choose from, and we've not had a whole lot of people show up for the in-person part, but we have. I mean, have people show up. It seems like the Board of Zoning Adjustments has had more people come for that meeting than our Planning Commission meetings. But yeah, we have had people show up to the locations, and yeah, it's kind of like going to BW3s and watching a ball game. You're showing up at a place to watch the Planning Commission. So yeah, it's been interesting, that's for sure.
Oh yeah, I will mention just briefly for those interested, for our legislative piece of our zoning work, Metro Council has used Metro TV for, I'm not exactly sure how long, as long as I've been an assistant county attorney. And so they have a slightly different, broadcasting system than we do at Planning Commission and Board of Zoning Adjustment. And they have fortunately been able to work with Metro TV throughout the process as well to make sure that even though you couldn't show up to council chambers, the public has still had access to the sort of final step in the zoning process, in addition to their other everyday legislative work.
So the term due process can take on many different meanings. What kind of due process issues can come up during or while someone's trying to conduct a virtual meeting?
The due process issues are largely the same. Sometimes they take a different form. So, for example, when we had the in-person meetings, you would have people who felt like they couldn't necessarily attend and be heard because work conflicted or traffic or childcare issues. They could stay, but not long enough. There's still a method by which you could always submit an email or a phone call or a letter to get your concerns on the record, but people want to be in person and communicate their concerns directly to the commissioners or the board members. Similarly, with the virtual meetings, you remove some of the physical barriers, and sometimes you remove the issue about you can turn on the meeting and sort of walk in and out, but you may have technology issues, internet connectivity, ability to work WebEx, and other technological concerns. Time concern may still be an issue, but it seems to be less of a concern in the virtual setting than it did in the physical setting.
Yeah, I know our Planning Commission has been very, we'll just say, forgiving of time limits, especially when we seem to have had more people show up for meetings, sometimes in the virtual context than we had in person. And so they definitely want to make sure that people get an opportunity to speak, especially when they're taking time to log in and do that kind of thing.
Yeah, and not only time limits, but we've loosened up a bit on our sort of order of operations out of necessity, right? I mean, you have folks who get disconnected, you have people who have their signal drop, that sort of thing. And obviously we don't want anyone to be unable to participate in this important public process because of a bad connection. At the same time, the meetings, have to proceed. So I think we've met a nice balance of working with people as much as possible, having people call by phone if their internet connection is continually problematic, that sort of thing.
Are you aware of any lawsuits that have been filed against entities doing virtual meetings?
So,
Not any,
yeah, go ahead.
not any with specific to Senate Bill 150 or a virtual issue. I mean, we have appeals of cases that have been heard on WebEx, but the issues being raised are the same sort of issues that are raised in the in-person meetings. You know, whether or not they've had due process, whether or not they feel the Planning Commission or the Board of Zoning Adjustment decided the case correctly based on the evidence provided.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. You know, not to be too technical, the way you phrase your question, yes, we've had appeals of virtual meetings, but not on the basis of these were conducted virtually and that's somehow impermissible or didn't conform to either Senate Bill 150 or general Kentucky law. It's been the sort of same old challenges we always heard, just with a slightly different way the record was assembled.
What are some potential changes that the legislature would need to consider to make virtual meetings more of a reality, both during and after the pandemic?
So the physical meeting space requirement, which we talked about earlier, is sort of the largest hurdle that was removed by Senate Bill 150 temporarily. And part of that is just kind of the current technological issues. And we've discussed this with regards to Planning Commission and Board of Zoning Adjustment, where depending on your facilities and technological limitations, access to IT support, that sort of thing, it can be difficult to have a sort of formal in-person camera that can capture a large room with, say, the full board on it, but also have individuals participating at home. It can become a little bit complicated to have a sort of mixed meeting, a hybrid meeting. And so eliminating that in-person requirement would allow a sort of, I think, more commonplace, or legally allow for it, maybe from a policy perspective. In-person still has some value. But I think that's the most significant impact that we've seen. And I hope that at very least we'll get some sort of study conducted by the legislature to see how well this happened, how well this worked throughout the Commonwealth. And, you know, if folks liked being able to participate from the safety of their own home.
Okay, and then we focus mostly on the virtual meeting component related to that. What are some of the other things that were temporarily suspended by Senate Bill 150 that like planners need to know about or have known about that are continuing?
So the largest one that I think developers have noted, and this is more on the back end rather than the front end of the process, is that the 90 days that Metro Council normally has to act on a Planning Commission recommendation for a zoning change has been suspended through Senate Bill 150. That's been, I think, the biggest one. But as a practical matter, I think as of right now, the Planning and Zoning Committee had caught up on its backlog. So I don't know that there's anything that's even close to the 90 days really at this point.
Yeah, I think we've done our best, and Metro Council has done its best to keep matters moving along. There certainly have been ones that have gone over the 90 days just because of a combination of factors. Obviously, COVID makes meetings more difficult, and there have been, you know, there's still the regular calendar of vacations, and Laura referred to, you know, the protests and such downtown. So there were some hiccups along the way that that did require a couple cases maybe to go longer than that 90 days. So it has been a helpful provision for Metro. But for the most part, we are caught up. It's worth noting, I think, that's the biggest date that we have focused on that has been asked about the most and that we've spoken about the most publicly. But there are other deadlines that are imposed on the Planning Commission, on BOZA, that are also lifted. Things like, I believe, subdivision approvals have a ticking clock that has been lifted. So there's been additional time for review from before cases even get in front of a public body. And so I can't speak so much to how that has impacted staff. I'm sure Brian could. But those are also still in effect, along with, you know, the rest of Senate Bill 150 as it pertains to KRS 100.
I'll just throw out as a reminder to people that the KRS 147A requirements have not been suspended. which is the continuing education requirements for not only staff, but for your planning commissioners and Board of Adjustment members also. I think I know our group, APAKY, we had a lot of questions about that when the emergency order first went into effect, was whether or not that was suspended, and it has not. So it of course, has been a challenge to try and continue to offer up continuing education credits to people. But luckily, we've also had to adapt and taken on virtual learning much more than we did before. And so, yeah, just a reminder to people to get out there and get those credits. So, anything else y'all want to mention while you got the planning spotlight here?
I think the one thing is to note that we did briefly go back to in-person. In August, we spent a month announcing it, and by the time we got to it, Delta had hit and the cases had risen. So we ended up, I think, going for 2 weeks, and we get asked a fair amount, mostly by our own commissioners and board members, about when we're going back to in-person. And I think the cases would need to drop to a point where we feel like we could get more than 2 weeks in, because I know it's a great deal of work for staff to switch from one format to the other. So my thought is it probably won't be any time in the immediate future.
I would just point out that hopefully the current January 15th deadline, I mean, ideally, I hope it's reasonable and that is, safe and healthy for everyone to be able to go back to quote unquote business as somewhat usual by that time. If it doesn't happen, I really hope that the legislature is proactive in, potentially extending that deadline if needed, because it got sort of a day-to-day, hour-by-hour there for a while. Is 150 going to come down or is it not? How's that going to impact our day-to-day? And so folks who weren't offering a physical location might have had to immediately, cancel or postpone meetings, that sort of thing. So now this time it's not, decided by a lawsuit. Hopefully it's some legislative action. So at least we have a hard drop dead date at the moment. And if that is going to require extension, then hopefully that's done with enough notice that folks aren't left wondering whether or not their meetings will be valid 2 or 3 days before.
Again, appreciate you all taking a few minutes to talk to me today, and we will continue to monitor and see where this thing takes us. But I know I certainly appreciate the direction that you all have helped lead our staff in the Planning Commission. So thank you all very much for everything that you all do.
You're welcome, Brian. Oh, there was one other thing I wanted to mention just real quickly.
Oh yeah, sure.
If folks are interested in the sort of decision-making process that Metro has gone under in this broader discussion about public meetings and the value of in-person versus virtual communication and who is being included and excluded, benefited or hurt by these decisions, there are across various recording sites in front of the Planning Commission, in front of Metro Council. There's been a lot of that discussion, and it primarily happened, I want to say, over the summer, probably of last year, June and July or so. I don't have specific dates for you, but if you are interested in engaging in some of that information, it's available on the Legistar site that the Metro makes their meetings available to the public group. So if you really want to dive into some policy discussions, that's a good place for it.
Yes, again, if anybody has questions, they can route those through me, and I'll help guide you there. So yeah, that's a good point. All right, thank you very much. Y'all have a great day.
So we wanted to give an opportunity to a private practice attorney to listen to the sessions and provide any input or feedback that they may have. So do you have anything to add to what we just heard?
As an attorney representing clients at Planning Commission and those at hearings, I have to say that COVID made my job, which is difficult to begin with, even more difficult. I can't tell you how much easier it is to participate in a meeting in person versus utilizing a platform like Zoom. It seems like every community uses a different platform. The meeting processes are different. It's difficult to know when to speak and what to say when speaking. It's difficult to coordinate with my clients, their civil or transportation engineers, surveyors, appraisers, and other witnesses supporting my client's case. It's nearly impossible to read the room to get a feel for which way a planning commissioner is leaning. Sometimes it feels like a complete crapshoot on the outcome of the case. And while it appears that most jurisdictions do a good job trying to make sure that everyone has a chance to speak, to voice their opinion, there are instances for sure or someone doesn't know or understand the technology needed to participate over Zoom. Of course, some people would choose not to attend an in-person meeting as well because of their concerns over potential to contact or spread COVID. It's often a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. All that being said, I have to commend the efforts of local planning commissions being willing to utilize new technology to keep development happening. Prior to COVID, I would bet that nearly no one ever used Zoom. Now we are conducting public meetings, keeping rezonings moving forward, getting development plans approved, getting building permits approved. Ramping up technology in order to keep business flowing wasn't easy, I'm sure, but most commissions that I'm aware of didn't miss a beat. Even though Zoom might not be an ideal situation, it's better than no meetings. It's better than risking personal health during periods of increased COVID numbers. It's been a good tool, and I appreciate the local planning commission's ability to adapt.
Okay, thank you for your feedback.
At this time, we're joined by Tim Tyson, an attorney out of Northern Kentucky, who's going to give us some information about the use of drones in planning. Tim, if you would, go ahead and introduce yourself to the panel here.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, hey, good day, Brian. Look forward to meeting you in person. It's great to do this virtually. My name is Tim Tyson, and so I'm the attorney for the Planning and Development Services of Kenton County, which is the staff for the Kenton County Planning Commission. I also represent two other planning commissions, Pendleton County and Bracken County, which are two rural counties here in Northern Kentucky. I'm a city attorney for the city that I live in, city of Fort Wright. I've also served on a planning commission for 14 years and was chairman for 9 of those 14 years in Kenton County. I've served on a board of adjustment for 2 terms, so I've got 8 years of experience doing that. And over the course of my career, I've represented a lot of different clients, both the developers and citizens opposing zoning in front of many, many different boards and commissions and in various courts. So.
Fantastic. Well, we appreciate you taking time to talk to us today a little bit about this subject. So let's just go ahead and just jump right in. How can a planning department take advantage of the use of a drone?
Okay, well, good question. So I got hired to represent PDS in Kenton County back about a year ago or so, and they had a drone that they owned already that they weren't using, and they asked me to look at ways to set up policies to protect the organization from its use. So I actually didn't know a whole lot more about drones than anybody that might ordinarily know from what they saw in the news or whatever, and ended up having to learn a lot about drones and how they're used and how they're regulated, by the way, and have sort of learned a lot myself even over the last year. So one of the things that's great about drones is that they frankly give a planning professional an opportunity to get camera images, either still photos or videos, in ways that you just can't get with a photographer standing on the ground taking a picture with a camera in hand. And so as a result of that, the presentations that a planning professional might make to a board or a planning commission or a legislative body can be enhanced by what can be taken from a drone. So a drone can be equipped with a camera that can be either a still photos or videos or both. And they can reach areas that you don't normally get with a camera. So if it's a swampy area, if it's a treed area, obviously they're aerial photography, so you get the opportunity to take pictures from above, and obviously it's hard to get a human up there unless you're in a helicopter or something like that. And you also can get current photos as opposed to using aerial photography that your planning commission staff might already have available to it through either a local process through its GIS system or through like Google Earth or something like that. You get this huge advantage of being able to take something particularly of the site, and it can be fresh. In other words, it can be the picture that was taken yesterday as opposed to something that you don't know for sure when it was taken, or it might have been taken a year or more ago and might not be current.
Yeah, so what does it take to start a drone program in a planning department?
Okay, well, great question, and it is not as challenging as most people would think. So the most important thing that you have to have is you have to have a staff person that you identify as the person that you want to be certified and trained to be a drone pilot. So there is a certification that they have to get and a training that they have to go through. It's not as complex as you might think. So the person that we have here went through, you can get certified, depending, of course, on how much the staff person knows going into it, for as little as 8 hours of training or up to 24 hours of training if you have somebody that doesn't have any drone experience at all yet. So literally a commitment of 1 to 3 days of training can get a person up to speed and certified as a drone pilot. Beyond that, then you obviously have to buy the drone, and you might see a lot of consumer level drones that are a lot less expensive than this. A planning department is probably going to want a more sophisticated drone, and that they typically run anywhere from about $1,500 to $2,000 to buy up front. So not generally cost prohibitive. And then once you have the drone in place and you have a pilot who's been certified to run it, the cost on an annual basis to actually have the drone and operate it, including insurance, any software or hardware that you might have to download the footage from it, that type of thing, you can usually get done annually for a couple $1,000s. And that would include the insurance premiums for the increased insurance premiums because of having a drone.
What are some of the things that can go wrong if a planning department chooses to use a drone?
Okay, great question. So when our organization looked at this, there were a lot of concerns, and so I ended up kind of going into doing some research into what could go wrong, and can we address these issues? So let me start by saying I'm gonna raise some issues of things that can go wrong with a drone. I will tell you that I can explain to you that each one of these issues can be dealt with. All right. So some of the issues that can go wrong. One of them is the drone can be used to invade a citizen's privacy. So you can imagine that if you wanted to, you could fly a drone over the sidewalk in front of somebody's house, point it at their window, and you might catch images of somebody walking around inside their house that they would not want shown in public. Okay, you could also theoretically fly it high enough to take a picture of, say, a lady sitting around her swimming pool in the backyard, and not, again, in a site where you wouldn't necessarily want to see that, and the person has a expectation of privacy. So you're not allowed to use a drone to trespass over private property, but from the elevation that you can go with a drone, you can do that. And so it's important to have protections in place against that. And then other things that can go wrong. So your drone pilot has to be licensed, and they can obviously lose their license. They have to be trained and licensed and certified and keep their training up to date. So that's important. There are height limitations on how high a drone can go. There are limitations that an agency is going to want to put on the use of the drone so that it conforms with their mission and doesn't go outside the realm of that. And frankly, you could end up having a drone operator that sort of goes rogue and is using it for personal purposes. And so it's important to have a policy in place to prohibit that, and a regulation of the use of the drone to make sure that it's not used inappropriately like that. Obviously a drone could also be flown into a building or flown into a car or into a person, and that building or car or person could get hurt. So those are things that can go wrong. You take videos and pictures that could end up becoming part of the public record. And so you have to protect against any privacy issues that might come up with any of the data that is obtained as a result of using the drone. So those are sort of some of the things that can go wrong if you have a drone.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned the public record thing, because that was, as you were going through it and talking about the kind of errant images that you may get, I thought about how that would become part of the record. Would something like that just have to be redacted, or are
Right.
What measures are in place to keep that in check?
Yeah. So yeah, great question, Brian. So as a public agency, our records are subject to a public records request or an open records request. And so all of the data that is received has to be brought in, and before it actually is used, the first job that you have to do once you bring the data back after the drone has been flown is to review what you have. And there are processes, as you can imagine, for editing out anything that is anyway problematic. So for example, if you happen to take a picture of something that is a person has a right of privacy over and that you didn't intend to get, you can blur that out or delete it out. You can also, like if you, and you may have seen this in some photos, Google Earth does this, if they take a picture of somebody's car and it shows their license plate number, they will blur that out. And so the same kinds of things happen. It's fairly simple to do once you know how to do it, but once that data comes in, it needs to be redacted and then ready for public review. And you need to have a policy in place that says that the raw data is not a public record until it has been redacted. And the law allows us to do that.
Awesome. Thank you. So you've talked about the policies. What are the goals of the policies that need to be implemented if a planning department intends to use a drone?
Okay, well, good. Well, each one of those challenges that I mentioned earlier are things that you need to address in your policy. So we have gone through and drafted a fairly significant policy. I think Brian was going to make it available to the attendees for their records so you can kind of see what we've done. And obviously that can be used sort of as a model. And so all of those problems that you have to have in place. What we have done is create a set of policies that requires the agency to keep up with state and federal laws. And by the way, they are evolving on a regular basis. Drones are obviously a little bit novel and new. As they get used more, issues arise. The federal government has been changing the law relating to drone almost every year. And so somebody has to keep up with that. And both the pilot and the attorney for the organization have to kind of be prepared to kind of keep an eye on what changes are happening. And then, you need to have policies in place that govern the storage of the data and when it can be used, and a verification that before it goes out that it's approved, after it comes back that the data is stored, so that you don't end up having unintended uses of the drone.
You've talked about some of the rules that are associated with that. What are some of these rules that apply to how your drone is used? Okay,
well, good question. So just generally speaking, right now there is a 400-foot height limit. So your drone is set up so that it won't go more than 400 feet high, and then it sets off a buzzer if you start getting close to that. And that's for aviation purposes, obviously. So 400 feet, which is more than high enough. So you normally think about a 40-foot building, 40-story building. You don't oftentimes need to go much higher than that for our purposes. There is a visual line of sight requirement, and this is so that the drone is less likely to be flown into something if you have a visual line of sight. So you can't go somewhere where you're surrounded by trees and have the drone fly someplace where you can't see it. By the way, oftentimes a pilot has somebody with them that can provide a second set of eyes to watch for the drone, because the drone pilot himself may be looking at the device itself, the management device itself, and so it's good to have a second set of eyes there when you're doing it. There are rules about using it in adverse weather. Obviously, with precipitation of any kind can affect the drone itself, but also they're subject to wind as well. So if you have a really windy day, or if you have a forecast for precipitation, it's usually best to avoid using the drone on those days. And then, frankly, it's just making sure that management has authorized the use of the drone for the particular project, making sure that you download and redact the data that you receive, and then keeping the training of the pilot up to speed.
You all have a large airport up in Kenton County, in the area. What kind of clearances do you have to go through, or notifications do you have to give them in order to operate the drone?
Well, good question, Brian. So it's not a problem because as long as you use the drone within the limitations of height that are regulated, these are actually regulated in conjunction with the FAA. And so we're allowed to go up to 400 feet. And by the way, there are regulations about you're not allowed to fly within certain distance of airports as well. And I hadn't mentioned that only because our airport, which is operated by Kenton County, actually sits in Boone County. So,
Oh, okay.
but if you happen to have like even a small local airport in a community, you have to. There are certain areas that you have to avoid with a drone, and the pilots know that from their training.
Can you tell us about the insurance coverage that may be needed in order to operate a drone?
Yeah, good question. So one of the things we looked into really closely is we didn't want to operate a drone if we didn't have good coverage. And so we were able to go and look into this with we had a commercial liability policy like most of the organizations in the Kentucky chapter of the APA would probably have. And we were thrilled to know that our policy covered for a lot of the liability risks associated with the drone. There is, however, a special rider that you get to a commercial liability policy if you're going to operate a drone. So I will tell you that the executive director or planning director, whatever their title is in each one of the organizations, if they operate a drone, should call their insurance company and have a rider added. And that rider, in our case, and we're a fairly good sized organization, didn't add much premium. It was only like $1,000 a year of additional premium to have the drone coverage. And we were thrilled with the level of drone coverage. It was very comprehensive in nature, covered both the drone itself if it were to be damaged. So think like if you have an auto policy, you want to have coverage not only for damage that might happen as a result of the use of the drone, but also if the drone itself is damaged in some way that you've got coverage for it as well. And we were able to get that kind of coverage at a reasonable amount, which allows us to operate the drone now that we've got the drone acquired on an annual basis of probably less than $2,000 a year.
What are some of the ongoing legal issues relating to drones?
Yeah, great question. So we've talked about this a little bit. I think the most important thing for all of the attendees to remember is that because drones are still sort of novel, the law and regulations about them are evolving. And so it's really important that if you get into a drone operation in your organization, that you kind of keep up to speed with the ongoing and developing law and regulations about the drones. And they change every year. The federal government has changed the rules every year. Typically, it's minor changes that don't necessarily affect the use of them, but it's new things and new limitations on when you can do them and where you can do them and that kind of thing that you just need to kind of keep up with. And that's why it's important to make sure that you have both a drone pilot and the attorney for the organization that are committed to keeping up to speed on any new developments in the law that change from the last time you looked at them.
Are you aware of any appeals or cases against local jurisdictions using drones? Has there been anything like that in Kentucky or elsewhere that maybe you've read about?
Well, I have not read about any in Kentucky yet. There are certainly a lot of lawsuits that have been filed across the country for use of drones. The privacy issue is a big thing. Obviously, if the drones get flown into a building and they cause damage, that's an insurance claim that can end up in a lawsuit if it's not settled. I actually would say that I'm a little bit surprised that there's not more litigation. And I think the biggest reason why is because the FAA has taken it very seriously and has kind of jumped all over it, and they are regulating its use. And so you don't have, as much litigation as you might think could happen from the use of a drone.
Are you aware of any other Kentucky jurisdictions or jurisdictions in nearby states that are using drones in similar ways that Kenton County is?
Well, I will tell you, I don't know of any other planning organizations, but I'm sure there are. I know there are a lot of police organizations that are using them. And there are different rules that relate to police organizations than planning commissions. For example, the data that they receive, if it's part of an ongoing criminal investigation, they don't have to make public record. Okay, so they have a little more freedom of use. The kind of things I was talking about earlier about redaction and stuff like that is stuff that applies to a planning commission that doesn't necessarily apply to a police agency so much. But I think it's one of those things that I can see a lot of planning agencies going into drones in coming years, only because it creates opportunities for visuals that you don't have from the ground, and it's up-to-date kind of video that you know, aerial photography that you don't get from other sources, and it just it's another tool in your tool belt when you're a planner.
Yeah, I know I've recently read an article that Oldham County they have started, or they are in the process of starting a kind of a drone team for emergency situations that they're going to use for emergency responses. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that goes and how it may expand in the future, both in Oldham County and then to other counties. Any other information or words of wisdom you have for us?
No, I would say in closing, just I'd be happy to help anybody that gets involved in it. If you have any questions or you're considering, I'd be happy to share what our experience is. I was happy to share our draft of the policies that we implemented, which we felt like are pretty comprehensive as far as regulating the use of the drone and avoiding the kind of problems that can occur with them. So I'd be happy to help anybody that's looking into implementation of a drone in their program.
All right. Well, thank you again for taking time to talk to us. We really appreciate it. This is such an interesting topic, and you know, not one that most people are familiar with. So we definitely appreciate you sharing your expertise with us.
Yeah, glad to do it. Thanks, Brian.
Now we have our anonymous private sector attorney here to provide some rebuttal or comments to the previous section that we just heard. Mr. Attorney.
As a private practice attorney and a taxpaying citizen, I have concerns about the cost of starting a drone program, the staff time needed to train an employee, the need to have 2 employees on site every time the drone is utilized, the $2,500 annual cost for insurance and related costs, and a significant investment, especially in smaller jurisdictions. I'm not sure that most communities would be able to have a program like that. However, I do like the idea of being able to get better real-time before and after pictures and video of my client sites. I definitely think this is a type of technology that we should look into as a better means to serve our clients.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, joining us now is Kristin Curry from the Lexington-Fayette County Urban Government. Kristin, you want to introduce yourself real fast? Tell people who you are.
Sure. Hi, I'm Kristin Curry, and I work with the Environmental Services Division at the Lexington-Fayette Urban County Government. I'm the Senior Environmental Planner there, and I am your Legislative Committee Chair for the APA Kentucky.
You are, yeah, and I appreciate you taking time to join us for this session. So let's just go ahead and jump right in. Why is it important for planners to follow along with what the General Assembly is discussing during their legislative sessions?
Well, as you can imagine, the legislature has authority over areas of planning that impact not only our local government operations, but costs and fees. So there's always a lot of interest in things like sanitary solid waste disposal. There was a bill last session that dealt with billboards and digital advertising. So those are some of the items that can come up, and we track those daily to see where bills are filed, what committees they're in, what the debate is focused on, and if there are different votes, and then they get passed in one chamber and then go to another, and we track that progress until it goes through to either a signature by the governor, or if the governor vetoes legislation, then it can go back to the legislature and they can override the veto, and it can even pass on through to the Secretary of State's office. So we track the legislation from the very beginning, pre-filing, all the way through enactment.
And veto, you mentioned the veto or the overriding vetoes, and that's something that is a little more possible now because of the supermajority that the Republicans have. Isn't that right?
Exactly right. And, normally we don't see too many of those, but in this last session from the regular session in 2021, there were 43 bills that became law without the governor's signature. So that is about more than twice in the last 2 previous years. So, there's a lot of fireworks going on in Frankfurt between the different Democrats and Republicans, and also between the legislature itself and the governor's executive office.
What's one item that the General Assembly discussed in 2021 that might be of interest to planners?
Sure. Let's see, the digital advertising for the billboard, that bill passed, it was House Bill 328, and it actually addressed some legislation, a court decision that brought into question the ability for having the digital advertising. And there was a federal court ruling that called into question the constitutionality of some of the provisions of Kentucky's prior outdoor regulations for advertising, and about 100 new billboards sprang up in the state, many of which were not compliant with the earlier provisions here in Kentucky. And so that legislation did go through and was passed, so it justified the regulation of the outdoor advertising. And Kentucky has regulated outdoor advertising, by the way, since 1965. So it's been a long-standing precedent, and that federal legislation just really put a kink in things, and the session had to address that and restore the authority for us to regulate outdoor advertising, and that did go through, and it went through as declaring an emergency, which means that it takes effect upon enactment instead of later on after the session ends.
Yeah, I know I drive the I-65 corridor from time to time, and definitely noticed the new billboards that sprang up in that kind of interim period between the lawsuit and then the new rule being put in place.
Right. It's definitely, I can remember back in the 70s and early 80s, there was a lot of talk about the billboards and the visual clutter, and so we had really tightened up those regulations since then, and it's good that we're back to being able to do that.
All right. What might be something that we can expect the General Assembly to discuss in 2022?
Well, okay, there are already, as of Friday the 17th of September, 64 pre-filed bills. And some of them deal with things like transgender rights. And on the flip side, there's some proposed legislation dealing with athletics in public schools, and proposing that competitors compete in each of their biological sex categories and not their transgender categories. So there's legislation on both sides of that. There's some emergency insulin program legislation that's been proposed, and not only in regard to insulin, but also regarding non-prescription or prescription drugs that are non-insulin, and putting caps and thresholds on those. So a lot of medical issues, a lot of transgender rights, also race-based education in public schools. But the majority of the pre-filed bills are also still dealing with COVID. Things like COVID passports, the ability of employers to mandate vaccinations, a prohibition proposing that houses of worship are excluded from emergency orders. And then one that is interesting maybe for planners specifically is that there's a bill resolution 226 is proposing to allow local plan review for plan review, inspection, and enforcement of school plans that deal with efficient school design. And then there's also about COVID childcare licensure and masking, and post-secondary schools and masking. There's also a bill resolution that allows for first responders who die of COVID, that there's now, if this gets passed, according to this bill resolution, a presumption that they would have died in the line of duty, thereby qualifying them for death benefits. So it's sort of all over the place, but it's still COVID heavy.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Obviously. Well, where am I at? So the General Assembly, usually when they meet, there's like a long session and a short session, and they kind of rotate those by year. What is 2022?
Well, the session starts January 15th, and normally it runs from January through March, and they have from now, where we're doing the pre-filing, all the way through in March, where they're filing bills. And then there's a time where the governor responds, and they take a break, and then they have another, I think it's about 5 weeks through May, where they can continue to file. And then after that, there's about 10 days where the governor can veto, and then the activity in the legislature is responding to potential vetoes and overriding those or letting those go through to the Secretary of State without signature.
All right. Yeah, thanks for sharing that information. So
Sure.
as you mentioned, you are on the APA Kentucky Legislative Committee. What are some of the main activities of that committee?
Well, we have an extensive work plan, actually, that the chapter has, and we will be reviewing that each year. But the committee itself right now, we're a committee of one. We have usually had maybe 2 people on it, but right now it is just me. But we track the legislation in each session. We have an Excel spreadsheet where we put active links to the different versions of the laws that are filed, and you can follow along the process of where it's going through each chamber, each committee. Also, we communicate with the executive committee about potential issues and evaluate whether we need to have a response, whether that's an email blast to the membership, or I have a list of interested parties who want to stay more often and more in depth in touch about the legislation in the session. So I send out my list. Also, we liaison with our partner organizations like KCO and the Kentucky League of Cities, and also even look through other organizations like the Kentucky Resources Council, where there might be overlap. And in the past, we have partnered with KLC to respond to a couple of issues. Some of the staff here in Lexington that are involved with the Division of Planning, we've run things through our law division and then through our legislative committee and our executive committee with APA, and have sent out a response that usually the KLC people then advance that, but it takes into account, our interests as well, and elevates that up to the legislature. Another thing that both myself and one of the other committee members have done is to participate at the national level with the APA and their digital summits on advocacy and planning. And so the one I attended last year focused on grassroots advocacy and creating messaging to get out into the community, and digital tools like dashboards that would put out calls for action and educate members about breaking issues in the session. One of those applications is called Voter Voice, and it's pretty extensive. What it can do is pretty impressive.
Sounds like there's a lot that people can learn about and kind of further their professional development by being on that committee, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you really get to understand the resource and authority on which all of our mandates are based, and to understand how at the state level policies go out and then trickle down to the local governments, city and county. And also just the idea of building relationships with legislators and partner organizations, and seeing how when you're just one organization, you're just, you know, a small fish in a big sea, but when you join with other organizations, you can really make an impact.
All right, great. Well, if anyone's watching this and they think, man, this sounds like something I want to be involved with, you know, how can they do that?
Yeah, absolutely. People can contact me, and I'm going to share my screen and put that up so you can see. And let me know, first of all, if you want to be added to my email list for the sessions and to get updates. And second of all, if you would like to join us on the legislative committee. One of the things that we're hoping to do in the future is to, whether it's virtually, if COVID is still an issue, or eventually in person, put together some kind of training platform. It might be a day on the Hill in Frankfurt if we can get, you know, past COVID, where people can learn about the legislative process and how to contact their legislators and how to create an ask regarding an issue of interest. So you can email me at LFUCG. If you want to go to the LRC website and see any of the pre-filed bills, I've put the link up there for you for that as well.
Anything else you want to add? Or are you going to click on?
Yeah, I'm looking for, there's the button. Yeah, so I would just extend an invitation to you all to join us and to join me in tracking the session, and just to have your voice heard about any issues that you have that you're interested in that you would like for us to track.
Yeah, well, let me just say on behalf of the APA board, you know, thank you for everything that you do with tracking the legislative information, because, you know, there are a lot of things, and it's easy for things to kind of slip by if you're really not paying attention to it. And so, as someone that receives your emails, I definitely appreciate the emails and, you know, and the information that you relay on to us whenever they are in session. So, great work, and you know, continue doing what you're doing.
Well, thank you, Brian, and certainly it is always good to hear from people. You know, I'm in the Central Bluegrass, and things are happening all over the state. So when someone in a local area has a relationship with a local business or local government or local legislator, and they have some information that they want us to go into in more depth, that is always helpful. So please reach out, and again, we would love to have you join our committee. Thank you, Brian.
All right, thank you, Kristin.
All right, and after hearing our last session about the legislative committee, do you have any comments on what you heard relating to that topic?
I'm glad to hear that the folks at APA Kentucky are keeping track of legislation as it's passed. Makes my job easier if local planning commissions know the laws and are following them. The question, though, even if an attorney isn't a member of the organization, could they still participate on the legislative committee?
That is a good question. I think we'd be happy to have anybody participate on our legislative committee, especially if it's a private practice attorney that deals with local legislative law. So thanks for posing that question. Appreciate your input and feedback today.
Very much. At this time, we would like to begin the question and answer portion of the presentation. However, since this is kind of a non-traditional presentation and the speakers aren't on site, what we would like to do is if anyone here that is in the physical location would like to share their experiences with any of the topics that were presented today, you may do so now. Thank you very much for attending the Planning Law Roundtable Discussion at today's conference. We appreciate you taking time to sit in with us and watch this video, and to anyone who may be watching the video virtually. We would especially like to say thank you to our speakers today for taking time out of their busy days to sit down and talk with both Brian and myself. So thank you very much to Tara Knight, Laura Ferguson, Travis Feaster, Tim Tyson, and Kristin Curry. If you have any questions at all for the panelists who spoke today, feel free to reach out to either me or Brian Howard. Our email addresses are here on the screen, and we will forward your questions to them so that we can hopefully get an answer. Also, if there's any information that you want regarding the sessions that was discussed, again, please reach out to us via email, and we will see about getting that information to you. So once again, thank you all very much. Hope you have a great day and a great rest of the conference.